Thank you for joining us for another Wednesdays in the Word. And I am excited again about our series, The Big Questions of Life. And I think this is a very, can I say it one more time? A very important questions that I think many Christians don't really take the time to distill and to analyze as it relates to their walk with God. And I would even say people in general, people who may be even outside of the faith, people who are marginal to the faith. This is a question that ought to cause us to stop, to pause and reflect and ponder what life is all about. And so in this video, we want to raise the question, how do I find my purpose? Thank you for joining us. And again, I think this is maybe or possibly the most important question that we ought to ask and try to answer. It's a question that I try to even ask myself as an older preacher Christian at this stage of my life, because I want to be clear on exactly why God has put me on this planet. And so the question I think is appropriate. How do I find my purpose, or why am I here? Why has God put me on this planet? And this is one of the reasons why I am not an atheist, because atheism at its rudimentary level says there's no meaning, there's no purpose to creation, there's no purpose to the earth, there's no purpose in the cosmos. And the moment you take out purpose, what is the basis for creating good? What is the basis for doing what is right or what is compassionate? And I'm sure there are many that would argue against that, as if like I'm suggesting that somehow an atheist can not have morals. I'm not suggesting that at all. I know a few atheists who probably lead better morally upstanding lives than Christians. But the truth is, if there's no final accountability, and there's not an intellectual atheist or academic atheist that would deny what I'm about to say. If there is no final accountability, what is the purpose of life? What's the sense of even having justice? Because if the world is like the jungle, then we simply evolve into what we become, and whoever survives, that is the natural course of justice. And so this purpose, this issue on end for me is one of the reasons why I'm not even an atheist, because everything that has been created has a purpose. Just like I'm communicating this YouTube video because I have a purpose in trying to communicate this lesson. Or if I use computers were created for a purpose, or my cell phone, or my car, or my home. Everything that has been created comes with some kind of purpose. Why would we not think about that for the cosmos? Why would we not think that for about each and every single human being on the planet? There are a couple of quotes I want to share with you before we jump into how we go about finding our purpose, as well as a few scriptures. The first one comes from Helen Keller. She said it like this: "The only thing worse than being blind is having sight and no vision." And I would say vision actually leads to purpose. I think that's great. Helen Keller, a blind, great individual who was blind and was a great individual, says, look, I know something about being blind, but it's worse than having sight. But what's worse than blindness is having sight and having no purpose. And then, of course, the late Miles Monroe, a tremendous Christian preacher and teacher, may have said it best, and he actually built his ministry on purpose and on the idea of purpose. And here's what he says: the greatest tragedy in life is not death, but life without a purpose. And so the question becomes, how do we find purpose? Why are we here? And so there's a few scriptures I want to point you to. Acts 13, verse 36 says this about David: "Now when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep," that is, he died, "and he was buried with his ancestors, and his body decayed." And so here, the statement is made about David that as the king of Israel, he served God's purpose. He served in a role that gave a sense of fulfillment and meaning to his life. And so there we have, even as Christians, there's a sense of purpose. You see it in Isaiah 46:10-11. God says this, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come, I say. My purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. For the east I summon a bird of prey, and from a far off land a man to fulfill my purpose. I have said that I will bring about what I plan, that I will do. So even here we see God raises up people to fulfill his purpose. And it's really within that frame, within that window, that I'm lifting up this idea on how to find our purpose. Purpose always starts and ends with God. And so here Isaiah depicts God as the one who has made purpose. He's the one that calls people with purpose. And we will surely talk about that a little bit later. And then, of course, John 12:27. Now my soul is troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour. And many times Jesus in his earthly ministry, he talked about how his hour had not yet come. And yet here, when he says his hour had come, the time of crucifixion, it is an indirect way of referring to his purpose. He was very, very clear on his purpose, which resonated God's purpose and plan in the earth. And so what I want to do in this video is to help us get a little bit closer to the purpose that God has for us. I'm not talking about a human-oriented purpose. I'm talking about a God-centered, a biblically centered, oriented purpose that directs us to the things of God, and where I believe with all my heart we find our greater sense of meaning and fulfillment in life. And so what I want to do is present to you 5 ways that I believe can help you discern, distill, and discover your purpose, if you will. Even at the age of 62, I'm always rethinking, fine-tuning. I'm always going back to this question because I always want to be in the lane that God called me to run. And even as a pastor, as a Christian within a church, there's a very, very specific and fine-tuned purpose in which God wants me to serve. And I've discovered in my personal life, when I really, really am in line with that purpose, I have a greater sense of peace, a greater sense of fulfillment, a greater sense of meaning. And so that's what I want to share with you today, to help you get to the place where you can at least get a sense of where your purpose is and where you need to start journeying toward that purpose, but also too, how God uses and helps you fine tune that purpose throughout your journey of faith with him. And so number 1, for me, it's going to be personality. Our personality. That is, your personality is probably a window into what your purpose may be. And I really believe this, that certain vocations in life, certain places and roles in life, they match certain personalities. I tend to be more introverted, but at the same time, I tend to be an individual that just is joyful. That's just kind of how my spirit. I don't consider myself super spiritual. I was actually accused recently of always having a smile on my face. And it's not something in terms of being funny or phony or artificial. No, it's just my personality. If you've been around me long enough, I like to have fun. I like to laugh. I pretty much do that. And so that kind of helped me see that within a church environment, that's something that people need. They need that encouragement. They need to know they can be themselves. They need to know that they're accepted. And that really is the broad parameter of my calling in ministry. Very compassion driven, very encouragement driven, very truth driven as well, as I believe I'm a teacher as well. But really that boundary where I believe that God gave us a faith where we can be ourselves and yet find a sense of joy, fun, and fulfillment in all that we do. And so I would say number 1, personality. And I'm going to allude to it right here now. Our church actually does a place assessment. Actually, it's one that's going to happen this weekend. I'm going to include that information and link in this video so you can get to it. But that is a great tool just to help you get some clarity and some focus on your purpose. It is designed to help us get connected with what God is doing in the kingdom and in the church, but I see it also in a broad sense. It really helps us understand ourselves and understand how God has uniquely crafted us. So I want to encourage you, if you've never done that, that is something to look into. So number one, it's going to be personality. Number two, it's going to be experiences. Your experiences, whether good or bad, actually shape you in terms of who you are, and they really contribute to how you are designed for a particular purpose. Unfortunately, in today's culture, we only want to cling to the good experiences and we want to ignore all the bad experiences. And I get it. There's some bad experiences I want to forget as well. There's some bad experiences and tragedies I really want to leave in the rearview mirror, and then I want to tear off the rearview mirror so I never have to look at them again. But the truth is, those experiences, many times God is using them to shape us, to sensitize us to our purpose, to help us see on different levels exactly how that purpose is coming about. And many times we can ignore that element in our life and actually miss how God has wired us to care for people, to be a presence in the lives of people, because we've been through similar experiences that they've been through. And so for me, I like to always quote Luke chapter 2, verse 41, where Jesus goes up to Jerusalem with his parents for the festival of the Passover. Remember, he's living in Nazareth, which is north. And so he goes south down to Jerusalem, which is a really long journey. It's about a 5-hour bus drive. I can't imagine walking that journey, but they would walk it every year. And for whatever reason, this year, Jesus stays behind in the temple. And he has some conversations. His parents don't even realize that he's been gone for a whole day. They go back and find him in the temple. And he tells them, didn't you know I was about my Father's business? And I believe this is the first time Jesus, as a little boy, begins to kind of sense his purpose. He begins to sense why the Father has placed him on this earth. That Passover begins to resonate. And I take it to mean that he begins to see that, hey, maybe God is calling me to be the Passover lamb. I'm the one that's going to be the sacrifice for the entire world. Where the Passover lamb was a sacrifice for Israel, I'm going to be that lamb that is sacrificed for the sins of the world. So I believe with all my heart that here, this experience, though, it has a tint of negativity in it, because Mary and Joseph were concerned that they couldn't find him, and they were a little bit upset and kind of scolded him. It turned out to be maybe that first layer, that first link that opened the door to the purpose of Jesus. So I want to encourage you, don't ignore any of your experiences. Many times we may need a therapist to walk through those experiences, to work out the details and how they've affected us. But many times you will discover a sense of the purpose that God has for your life if you go back and kind of meditate and evaluate your experiences. Number 3, calling. I strongly believe in calling. Surely there's a calling on preachers, there's a calling on churches, but I think many times Christians don't realize there's a calling on them without actually ever being clergy, without actually being formally connected to some kind of full-time ministry. There's a calling on every single Christian's life. And I believe the calling has to do with God's purpose in the earth. It's what I read about Isaiah at the beginning when I talked about Isaiah chapter 46, verses 10 through 11. And I talked about how God's purposes are being portrayed throughout or displayed throughout the earth. And he calls individuals to fulfill those purposes. So also here, God calls his people today to fulfill the purpose. Now, the question people ask me all the time, well, how do I know it's a calling? It's very simple. God shows you a problem and then says to you, does this move you? Does it bother you? Let's resolve this problem together. Let's be the solution. That's how you know. The late Lois Evans, the late wife of Dr. Tony Evans, would say, your misery is where your ministry is. The misery you've experienced, or the misery that God has pointed out to you, I should say. The problem that you see, whether in your life or in the lives of others, that disturbs you, that just rankles you, That's God working in our lives. That's that calling. He shows us the problem. He shows us the misery. And then he turns to us and says, you know what? Together we can partner and we can solve that problem together. That's probably your greatest sense of calling. You can put here Exodus 2, verses 11 through 12, where Moses, he's living in the lap of luxury. We would say he's a big wig in corporate America. He's living in high society. He's not living in middle class society or low class society. No, he's living in the top tier of the economic class in Egypt. But he sees his people being abused, and he sees one Israelite that's being taken advantage of. And he looks left, looks right. The old preacher would say he should have looked up. And he kills the Egyptian taskmaster that was abusing the fellow Israelite. And here we get a glimpse in this negative experience, this desire to see Israel be liberated from their oppressors. And so we see a sense of Moses' purpose. Though wrong-headed, though done with the wrong method, we see the ministry opportunity is there. And God would allow him to spend some 40 years on the backside of a wilderness, and he would experience the burning bush calling, and he would do it God's way, which is the right way. But early on, we see God has put a calling on him, has put a passion on him, a sense that, hey, something here is not right. And God says, you know what? Together we can solve it, but we're not going to do it your way, Moses. I know you want to do it a human way. I know you want to do it with violence. I know you want to do it and conquer the people who have conquered you. That's not the way I'm going to do it. We're going to do it a little bit differently. We're going to do it with a display of God's glory and his power. Excuse me. And so number 3 for me is going to be calling. Number 4, and definitely this is an important one, advice. That is, you ought to seek out wisdom from people who are walking or have walked the path that you're praying about or you're thinking about walking. I just don't see many people doing this. This is clearly what I'm thinking in terms of if it's ministry or preaching or teaching. Obviously, we kind of take those for granted, but I'm arguing this should be with everything, whether it's a relationship, whether it's marriage, whether it's a career move, whether it's launching out into your own business, whether it's going back to school. I don't care what it is. I think many times we think, well, you know, God put this on my heart. It seems like a good thing. I don't need to talk to anybody. I can go ahead and chase it. I think that is bad. I think God definitely speaks to us through prayer. He speaks to us through his word. But many times I don't trust myself because sometimes I can guide myself to hear something that I want to hear. So I want to hear counsel. I want to hear advice from people that I respect. I want to hear advice from people who have maybe a broader palette of convictions than I do. Because I know if they live by certain convictions, they're going to tell me their honest opinion based on the truth they hear. And to me, that's when you really make an informed decision. And I just think this, many times we take this step for granted. There's a great scripture on this, Proverbs 15:22. This is a Good News translation. And it says, get all the advice you can and you will succeed. Without it, you will fail. I think that's very, very true. You need to talk to people that's already doing it. You need to talk to people who've been through it. You need to talk to people who maybe tried it and failed, and maybe they came back, or maybe they didn't come back from it. I think you have to broaden the voices on this one, and then pray about what you hear as God leads you. And so advice is critical for me. And then the last one, when it comes to finding your purpose, eventually you can't avoid this step, and that is risk. At some point, you're just going to have to take a risk. That is, even after you've gotten all the information and you're 75% sure this is what you should be doing, don't think that somehow you need to wait on the other 25%. Now, some people may use 60% as a threshold. Some people may use 80%. For me, it was probably about 80 to 85%. I had received so much confirmation in terms of where I believe God was leading me that I just had to step out on that extra 15 or 20%. But even when I stepped out and took the risk for what I believe God was calling me to do, It's not like it wasn't risk in which it did not come with its hardships. It came with challenge. It came with heartache. It came with hardship. Many times things did not go the way that I expected. But for every time that things didn't go the way I didn't expect, God had a way of showing up to let me know that I was on the right path. So even when you've gotten all the previous four and you have all the information and you have all your T's crossed and every single I dotted except one, at some point, and to me, this is the real test whether it is a purpose that God is calling you into, you have to take a risk. You may have to meet and engage people you've never engaged before. You may have to reach across ethnic lines, or you may have to deal with people you're not accustomed to dealing with. You may have to minister in a place, or you may have to serve or work in a place that is contrary to what you're used to. Yet you know the calling or the position strongly reflects how God has wired you and what your spiritual DNA is. And many times that's exactly how the call works. That's how you know. I'm sure Moses, when he first went to Israel, he felt completely ill-equipped because he lived in luxury. I mean, he was in the higher echelons of society. He lived in economic prosperity, and he is being called to lead out people who were in slavery. You think they embraced him immediately? Absolutely not. And yet he took the risk and he stepped into it. Let me share a quote that I love. It comes from Chris Anderson. He's the curator for TED Talks. And here's what he said. He says, "I want a future in which people realize their potential to nudge the world." And that's my question to me. That's what purpose is about. Are you nudging the world for the Lord? Are you nudging the world toward God's purposes? I think that's a great quote. I think that's exactly what God is calling us in terms of purpose. If you want to know your purpose, that's what you want to know. Am I helping the world am I nudging the world with God in the direction that God wants it to go? Thank you for joining us in this lesson. I do want to drop a plug for one of the workshops we teach at Christ Community. It's called the Place Workshop. And many of the things that crystallized in my life really happened in this workshop. And usually this workshop is used to help people figure out their giftedness, their calling. But more than anything, I think it's a great workshop to help you figure out who you are. How do you function? Why do you like certain things? Why you don't like certain things, which I think is critical to figuring out the combination to your purpose. Your purpose is a function of how you are wired. No doubt about it. And so I post the information right here. You ought to check it out. It's something you ought to go through. It's worth the time. It doesn't take all day, but it's worth every minute. I've actually gone through it about 3 or 4 times. And usually the results tend to crystallize for where I know God has called me. And it helps me to stay focused on the very purpose that God has called me to. So God bless you. And I pray that you will begin on the path to being a part of the purpose that God has for you. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.